What if everything you thought you knew about the British royal family was built on a lie? What if a single message, hidden for 4 decades, could rewrite the history books and change the line of succession forever? In the shadowy corridors of Buckingham Palace, where whispered secrets echo through marble halls and loyal servants carry burdens heavier than crowns, one man held a secret so dangerous that it could topple the monarchy itself. For 40 years, he watched. He waited. He protected a truth that powerful people would kill to keep buried. This is not just another royal scandal. This is not gossip from the tabloids or speculation from palace insiders. This is the true story of James Crawford, a humble palace guard who became the keeper of the most explosive royal secret in British history. A secret about Prince William that even he doesn't know. A secret that began with a dying woman's confession and a message that was never delivered. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Others are meant to change the world. This is the story of the message that was meant for Prince William and the ordinary man who risked everything to make sure the truth would finally see the light of day. The clock is ticking. The secret can't stay hidden forever. And when it finally comes out, nothing will ever be the same again. The rain hammered against the tall windows of Buckingham Palace on that October evening in 1982, creating streams of water that looked like tears running down the ancient glass. James Crawford stood at his post near the servants' quarters, his black uniform crisp despite the long hours he had already worked that day. At 28 years old, he was still new enough to the royal household to feel the weight of history in every stone corridor he walked through, yet experienced enough to know that the palace held secrets darker than any London fog. James had grown up in a small town outside Manchester, the son of a coal miner and a seamstress. His childhood was filled with the sounds of his father's coughing from years underground and his mother's gentle humming as she worked late into the night, mending clothes for the more fortunate families in town. When his father died of black lung disease just after James turned 18, his mother had pressed a crumpled newspaper clipping into his hands. It was an advertisement for positions in the royal household, seeking young men of good character and strong constitution. Your father always said the royals were just people like us, but with fancier hats, his mother had whispered through her tears. Maybe you can find a different kind of life there, son. Something better than what this place can offer you. James had applied more out of desperation than ambition. The coal mines held no appeal for him, not after watching them slowly kill his father. When the letter arrived 3 months later, offering him a position as a junior guard at Buckingham Palace, his mother had wept with joy. She packed his few belongings into an old leather suitcase that had belonged to his grandfather, pressed a small Bible into his hands, and sent him off to London with all the hope and fear that mothers carry when their children venture into unknown worlds. The first months at the palace had been overwhelming. The sheer size of the place still amazed him, with its 775 rooms and corridors that seemed to stretch for miles. James learned to navigate the complex hierarchy of the royal household, where everyone from the highest-ranking courtier to the newest kitchen maid had their place in an intricate social structure that had evolved over centuries. He learned which hallways the royal family used and which were reserved for staff, which doors he was never to open, and which secrets he was never to acknowledge, even if he happened to overhear them. His supervisor, a stern man named Thomas Whitmore who had served the palace for over 30 years, had taken James under his wing during those early days. Whitmore was everything James aspired to become: dignified, discreet, and absolutely loyal to the crown. He taught James that being a palace guard meant more than just standing at attention and looking impressive in uniform. It meant being invisible when visibility wasn't wanted, being deaf when conversations weren't meant for their ears, and being absolutely trustworthy with information that could bring down governments if it fell into the wrong hands. The royals aren't just people, Crawford, Whitmore had told him during one of their late-night conversations in the guards' common room. They're symbols. They represent something bigger than themselves, bigger than any of us. Our job isn't just to protect their bodies. It's to protect what they represent. Sometimes that means protecting them from the truth, and sometimes it means protecting the truth from them. James had nodded, not fully understanding what Whitmore meant at the time. He would understand soon enough. The palace in 1982 was a place of great change and tension. Prince Charles had married Lady Diana Spencer just over a year earlier, and the fairy tale wedding that had captivated the world was already showing cracks behind the scenes. James had been present during several heated arguments between the royal couple, their voices echoing through corridors that were supposed to muffle such domestic disputes. He had seen Diana crying alone in empty rooms, her shoulders shaking with the weight of expectations she was too young to carry. He had also seen Prince Charles looking lost and frustrated, a man caught between duty and desire, tradition and personal happiness. But it was Princess Diana's personal maid, Elizabeth Morrison, who would change James's life forever. Elizabeth was a small, quiet woman in her 50s who had served various members of the royal family for most of her adult life. She had never married, dedicating herself entirely to her work with the kind of devotion that the palace required but rarely acknowledged. James had noticed her because she was kind to the junior staff, always offering a gentle word or a cup of tea to those who were struggling with the demanding pace of palace life. Elizabeth had a way of moving through the palace like a ghost, appearing when she was needed and disappearing when her work was done. The royal family trusted her completely, and James often saw her in deep conversation with Princess Diana, their heads bent together as they discussed matters that were clearly far more serious than wardrobe selections or daily schedules. There was something almost maternal in the way Elizabeth cared for the young princess, filling a role that Diana's own family seemed unable or unwilling to provide. It was on that rainy October evening that Elizabeth approached James during his shift. She looked pale and tired, more fragile than he had ever seen her before. Her usually perfect appearance was slightly disheveled, and there was something in her eyes that made James's stomach tighten with worry. "James," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I need to speak with you. Privately. It's important." James looked around nervously. Fraternizing with the personal staff was not exactly forbidden, but it was certainly discouraged. The hierarchy of the palace was designed to keep different levels of servants separate, preventing the formation of alliances that might threaten the established order. But there was something urgent in Elizabeth's voice that made him nod. "My shift ends in an hour," he whispered back. "The small garden behind the kitchen quarters. No one goes there after dark." Elizabeth nodded and disappeared back into the maze of corridors, leaving James to spend the next hour wondering what could possibly be so important that she would risk both their positions to discuss it. When James arrived at the small garden, he found Elizabeth sitting on a stone bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy and oppressive. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and James was shocked to see that she had been crying. "Elizabeth, what's wrong?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "You look terrible." She attempted a weak smile. "Always the charmer, aren't you, James?" But her attempt at levity quickly faded. "I'm dying," she said simply. The words hit James like a physical blow. "What? No, that's not possible. You seem fine. You've been working your normal schedule." "Cancer," Elizabeth said quietly. "The doctors say I have perhaps 3 months, maybe less. I've known for several weeks now, but I've been trying to figure out what to do about something I know. Something I should have spoken up about years ago." James felt the world shift slightly beneath him. In his 4 years at the palace, he had learned to recognize the weight of genuine secrets, and Elizabeth's words carried that weight in abundance. "I don't understand," he said. "What kind of something?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you know about Prince William's birth? The official story, I mean." James nodded. Everyone in Britain knew the story. Prince William had been born on June 21st, 1982, the first child of Prince Charles and Princess Diana. The birth had been front-page news around the world, the first heir to the throne born in a hospital rather than a palace, Another small sign of Diana's influence on royal tradition. The official story, Elizabeth repeated, but not the true story. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. James could see his own name written on it in Elizabeth's careful handwriting. I've been Princess Diana's maid since before her engagement, Elizabeth continued. I was there for everything. The wedding preparations, the honeymoon, the early months of their marriage. I was there when she first suspected she was pregnant, and I was there when William was born. She paused, looking directly at James. But I was also there for something else. Something that happened 3 days before the official birth announcement. Something that Princess Diana made me promise to keep secret, but also something she wanted recorded, just in case. The envelope seemed to pulse with importance in Elizabeth's hands. James felt his mouth go dry. 3 days before William's birth was announced to the world, Elizabeth continued, Diana gave birth to twins. The world seemed to stop spinning. James stared at Elizabeth, certain he had misheard her. Twins, she repeated. 2 baby boys. Identical twins. James's mind raced. But that's impossible. There's only Prince William. There's never been any mention of. Because only one of them is Prince William, Elizabeth said. The other baby was taken away that same night. Diana was told he had died during delivery, but that wasn't true. He was taken by palace officials and given to a family outside London. Diana was devastated, but she was also young and frightened and completely under the control of people who convinced her it was for the best. Elizabeth's hands were shaking now. But I saw both babies, James. I held both of them. And I saw the man who took the second child away. I heard the conversations about why it had to be done this way. I was sworn to secrecy, but Diana wanted someone to know the truth. Someone outside the immediate circle of palace officials who arranged it all. She pressed the envelope into James's hands. She wrote everything down that night, while she was still recovering from the birth. Every detail, every name, every reason they gave her for why her second son had to disappear. She gave it to me and made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, if she ever felt like she couldn't protect William or tell him the truth herself, that I would find a way to get this information to him. James stared at the envelope, feeling its weight like a stone in his hands. Elizabeth, this is impossible. If what you're saying is true, it means Prince William has a twin brother who doesn't know who he really is, Elizabeth finished. A brother who has the same claim to the throne that William does. A brother who was stolen from his mother and his birthright because powerful people decided that 2 heirs were more dangerous than one. The implications crashed over James like a wave. If this was true, it meant everything the public knew about the royal succession was built on a lie. It meant there was another prince somewhere in England, living an ordinary life, completely unaware of his true identity. Why are you telling me this? James asked. Why now? Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. Because I'm dying and Diana is becoming more and more unhappy. I can see her pulling away from Charles, becoming more independent. She's starting to ask questions about that night, starting to wonder if she was told the truth about her second son's death. I think she's going to start looking for answers, and if she does, it could destroy everything. She took James's hand in both of hers. I need someone I trust to keep this safe. Someone who will know when the time is right to reveal the truth. Diana trusted me with this secret because she wanted William to know about his brother someday, when he was old enough to handle it and strong enough to deal with the consequences. James looked down at the envelope again. His name, written in Elizabeth's precise script, seemed to glow in the dim light from the palace windows. How do you know you can trust me? He asked. Elizabeth smiled sadly. Because you're not like the others, James. You didn't come here for power or position or access to important people. You came here because you needed work, and you stayed because you're good at it and because you care about doing the right thing. I've watched you for 4 years. You treat everyone with respect, from the lowest kitchen maid to the queen herself. You keep confidences without being asked. And, most importantly, you're not afraid to question things when they don't seem right. She stood up slowly, looking older and more fragile than James had ever seen her. "I'm going to tell Princess Diana that I've given you the letter. She'll want to meet with you to make sure you understand how important this is. But, James, you need to understand something. This secret has already cost people their lives. The night William's twin was taken away, two of the medical staff who were present died in what were reported as separate accidents within a week. The official who arranged the adoption died of a heart attack 3 months later, even though he was only 35 years old and had no history of heart problems." James felt a chill run down his spine. "You think they were murdered? I think powerful people will do whatever it takes to keep this secret buried," Elizabeth said. "So you need to be very careful about who you trust and when you decide to act on what's in that letter." Diana wrote down everything she could remember, including the name of the family who took her second son and where they were planning to move. But that was over 4 months ago. Things might have changed. Diana wasn't ready to lose another child, and William's twin is safer if no one knows where he is. But someday, when the time is right, they need to know the truth about each other. Elizabeth disappeared into the shadows, leaving James alone in the garden with the envelope that would change his life forever. He sat there for a long time, staring at his own name written on paper that contained secrets worth killing for. When he finally returned to his quarters, James locked the door and sat on his narrow bed with the envelope in his hands. The weight of it seemed impossible for something made of paper and ink. He thought about Elizabeth's words, about Princess Diana's trust, about twin brothers who had been separated at birth for reasons that powerful people thought justified stealing a child from his mother. With trembling fingers, James opened the envelope and began to read the most dangerous words he would ever encounter. Words that would haunt him for the next 40 years. Words that would make him the keeper of a secret that could change the course of British history. The letter began simply, "My dearest William, if you are reading this, then something has happened to me, and it is time for you to learn the truth about your brother." James read Princess Diana's letter 3 times that night, each reading revealing new layers of a conspiracy that made his hands shake and his stomach churn. The neat handwriting, shaky in places from exhaustion and emotion, told a story that seemed too incredible to be true, yet too detailed to be fabricated. According to Diana's account, written just hours after giving birth, the delivery had been complicated from the beginning. The royal physicians had been expecting one child, but during the final stages of labor, they discovered she was carrying twins. The second baby had been positioned in a way that made the delivery dangerous, and for several terrifying hours, it seemed like both Diana and her children might not survive. When both boys were finally born, healthy and identical in every way, there should have been celebration. Instead, Diana wrote, there had been hushed conversations between the doctors and palace officials who had been present for the birth. She had been exhausted and weak from the difficult delivery, but she had heard enough to understand that the unexpected second heir was being viewed as a problem rather than a blessing. "They spoke as if I couldn't hear them," Diana had written, "as if I was too young and too tired to understand what they were discussing. But I heard every word. They said that 2 identical heirs would create constitutional problems. They said it would be impossible to determine which child was the true heir since they were born so close together. They said the uncertainty would create instability in the monarchy." The letter went on to describe how Sir Edmund Hartwell, the Queen's private secretary, had taken control of the situation. Hartwell was a man who had served the royal family for over 20 years, known for his ability to handle delicate situations with absolute discretion. He had explained to Diana that the second child would need to be removed from the succession line for the good of the monarchy. "Sir Edmund told me that my second son would be placed with a carefully selected family who would raise him as their own," Diana's letter continued. "He said the child would have a good life, a normal life, away from the pressures and dangers of royal existence. He made it sound like we were doing the child a favor by taking away his birthright. But Diana had not been fooled by the careful explanations. Even in her exhausted state, she had understood that powerful people were making decisions about her children without her consent. She had demanded to hold both babies, to see them together, to have a few minutes with both of her sons before one of them disappeared forever. I named them both in my heart that night, she had written. The firstborn would be William, as Charles, and I had already decided. But the second, my sweet second son, I called him Alexander in my mind, though I could never speak that name aloud. He had the same eyes as William, the same tiny hands, the same perfect features. He was my child, and they were taking him away from me. The letter described how Alexander had been taken from the hospital that night by a woman named Margaret Thornfield, who worked for a private adoption agency that specialized in placing children from sensitive situations. Diana had been told that the Thornfield agency had connections throughout England and could ensure that Alexander would be placed with a family far from London, people who would never suspect the true identity of the child they were adopting. James had to stop reading several times, overwhelmed by the emotional weight of Diana's words and the implications of what he was learning. This wasn't just a story about royal secrets or political maneuvering. This was a story about a mother who had been forced to give up her child, and about two brothers who would grow up never knowing they belonged to each other. The most devastating part of the letter was Diana's description of the lies she had been told about Alexander's fate. Palace officials had convinced her that the adoption was temporary, that when William was older and the succession was more secure, she might be able to reveal the truth and bring Alexander back into the family. They had promised that Alexander would be monitored from a distance, that reports about his well-being would be provided to her regularly. But the reports never came, Diana had written. When I asked Sir Edmund about my second son, he told me that contact with the adoptive family would be dangerous for everyone involved. He said that for Alexander's safety, all connections had to be severed completely. He said that trying to find him or contact him would only put him in danger. As James continued reading, he began to understand why Diana had written the letter and why she had entrusted it to Elizabeth. She had realized, even in those first few days after the birth, that she might never see her second son again. The letter was her attempt to ensure that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. My dearest William, the letter concluded, I pray that you never have to read these words because it will mean that something terrible has happened to me. But if you're reading this, then you need to know that you have a brother. His name should have been Alexander, and he should have grown up beside you, sharing your life and your future. Instead, he was taken from us both by people who believed that their political calculations were more important than a mother's love or a brother's bond. Diana had included as many details as she could remember about the adoption arrangement. The Thornfield agency had offices in Birmingham and Manchester. The adoptive family was named Henderson, and they had been told that they were adopting the child of a young woman who had died in childbirth. Mr. Henderson worked in engineering, and Mrs. Henderson was a teacher. They had been married for 8 years and had been unable to have children of their own. They seemed like good people, Diana had written. The woman from the agency showed me their photograph and told me about their backgrounds. They lived in a small town called Millbrook, somewhere in the countryside north of Birmingham. They wanted a son very much, and they promised to love him and give him every opportunity for a good education and a happy life. The letter also included a description of a distinctive birthmark that both William and Alexander shared, a small crescent-shaped mark behind their left ears. Diana had made sure to document this detail because she knew it would be the only way to definitively prove Alexander's identity if he was ever found. James folded the letter carefully and sat in the darkness of his room, trying to process everything he had learned. Somewhere in England, there was a young boy who had no idea that he was the twin brother of the future king of England. This boy, Alexander, was living an ordinary life with the Henderson family in Millbrook, completely unaware that his real mother was one of the most famous women in the world. The next morning, James went about his duties in a daze. Everything looked the same, but he felt like he was walking through the palace in a dream. The portraits of past royals that lined the corridors seemed to be watching him with knowing eyes. The conversations he overheard between staff members took on new significance as he wondered how many other secrets were hidden within the palace walls. It was late afternoon when Elizabeth approached him again, this time openly, as if their conversation the night before had been perfectly normal rather than treasonous. "Her Royal Highness would like to see you," Elizabeth said quietly. "Tonight, after the evening meal, the blue drawing room. She'll be alone." James felt his heart skip a beat. The blue drawing room was one of the formal receiving rooms used for important meetings. The fact that Princess Diana wanted to meet with him there, rather than in some hidden corner of the palace, suggested that she was taking an enormous risk. "Elizabeth," he said, "are you sure about this? If anyone finds out, she needs to know that you understand." Elizabeth replied, "She needs to know that someone besides me knows the truth about Alexander. And, James, she's becoming more determined to find him. I think she's going to do something soon, something that could be very dangerous for everyone involved." That evening, James made his way to the blue drawing room with his pulse racing. Princess Diana was standing by one of the tall windows when he entered, looking out at the palace gardens. She was wearing a simple blue dress, and her blonde hair caught the light from the crystal chandelier above. When she turned to face him, James was struck by how young she looked. At just 21, she was still more girl than woman, despite everything she had already endured. "James," she said, and her voice was softer than he had expected. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." James remained standing, uncertain of the protocol. He had never had a conversation with any member of the royal family beyond the polite acknowledgments that came with his duties. Diana smiled slightly. "Please, this isn't a formal audience. Sit down. We need to talk about Elizabeth's letter." James finally sat on the edge of a delicate chair, still feeling like an intruder in the elegant room. Diana sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap in a gesture that reminded him painfully of Elizabeth. "Elizabeth told me that she gave you my letter," Diana said. "Did you read it?" "Yes, Your Royal Highness," James replied. "I read it several times." "Then, you know about Alexander." Diana's voice caught slightly on the name. "You know what they did to him, what they did to both of us." James nodded. "I'm so sorry, Your Royal Highness. I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you." Diana looked down at her hands. "Do you have brothers or sisters, James?" "No, ma'am. I'm an only child." "I have 2 sisters," Diana said, "and I love them both dearly. But the bond between twins, James, that's something different, something deeper. Even in the short time I held both my babies, I could feel it. They belong together in a way that no one should have the right to break." She looked up at James, and he could see tears in her eyes. "Every day I wonder about him. Every time I look at William, I see Alexander too. I see the life he should be living, the childhood he should be sharing with his brother. And I think about the lies he's being told about who he is and where he came from." James felt the weight of the secret pressing down on him. "What do you want me to do, Your Royal Highness?" Diana was quiet for a long moment. "I want you to keep that letter safe," she said finally. "Elizabeth tells me that you're someone who can be trusted completely. I need to know that if something happens to me, if I can't tell William the truth myself, that someone will make sure he learns about his brother." "But what about finding Alexander now?" James asked. "The letter has information about where he was taken, the family he was placed with." "Surely." Diana shook her head. "I've thought about that every day since he was born. But Elizabeth is right. Trying to find him now would be dangerous for everyone. The people who arrange his adoption won't hesitate to hurt him if they think the secret is going to come out. And I can't risk putting him in danger just because I miss him." She stood up and walked back to the window. "But someday, James, when William is grown and strong enough to handle the truth, when the political situation is more stable, I want them to know each other. I want Alexander to know that he wasn't abandoned or unwanted. I want him to know that he has a brother who would love him, and that he has a heritage that was stolen from him." James joined her at the window. "How will I know when the time is right?" Diana smiled sadly. "You'll know. And until then, you'll watch and wait and keep the secret safe. Can you do that for me, James? Can you be the guardian of my son's truth?" James looked out at the palace gardens, thinking about the enormous responsibility Diana was asking him to accept. He thought about Alexander Henderson, somewhere in Millbrook, living a life that should have been entirely different. He thought about Prince William, growing up without knowing he had a twin brother. And he thought about Princess Diana, carrying the weight of this secret alone. "Yes, Your Royal Highness," he said quietly. "I'll keep the secret safe. I'll wait for the right time. And when that time comes, I'll make sure both your sons know the truth." Diana reached out and touched his arm gently. "Thank you, James. You don't know what this means to me." As James left the blue drawing room that night, he carried with him not just the burden of an incredible secret, but also the trust of a young woman who had already sacrificed more than anyone should have to for the sake of duty and tradition. He didn't know it then, but that conversation would be one of the last private moments he would ever have with Princess Diana. Within a few years, she would become one of the most photographed and pursued women in the world, and private conversations with palace guards would become impossible. Over the next several months, James watched Diana carefully, looking for signs that she might try to find Alexander on her own. He saw her growing more confident and independent as she adjusted to royal life, but he also saw the sadness that she carried with her everywhere she went. Sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, he would catch her staring at Prince William with an expression of such profound loss that it made James's heart ache. Elizabeth's condition deteriorated rapidly as winter approached. She continued working almost until the end, determined to fulfill her duties to Princess Diana for as long as possible. When she finally became too ill to work, Diana visited her personally in the small apartment she maintained near the palace, spending hours at her bedside. Elizabeth died on a cold February morning in 1983, just 4 months after she had entrusted James with the most dangerous secret in the British monarchy. At her funeral, attended by dozens of palace staff who had worked with her over the years, Princess Diana wept openly. James stood in the back of the small church, watching the woman who had trusted him with the truth about her son, and promised silently that he would honor that trust no matter how long it took or what it cost him. After Elizabeth's death, James became the sole keeper of Alexander's secret. The letter was hidden in a place where no one would ever think to look for it, and James began the long wait for the right time to reveal the truth. He didn't know it would take 40 years. He didn't know that he would watch Prince William grow up, get married, and have children of his own while his twin brother remained hidden in plain sight. He didn't know that Princess Diana would die without ever seeing her second son again. All James knew was that someday, somehow, the truth would come out. And when it did, he would be ready. The years that followed Elizabeth's death were among the most difficult of James Crawford's life. He carried the secret of Prince William's twin brother like a stone in his chest, feeling its weight with every breath he took. As he watched the young prince grow from an infant into a toddler, James saw constant reminders of the missing child. Every smile, every laugh, every milestone in William's development made James wonder about Alexander Henderson, growing up in Millbrook with no knowledge of his true identity. By 1985, Princess Diana had become a global icon. The shy young woman who had once wept in empty palace corridors had transformed into a confident public figure, beloved by millions around the world. James watched this transformation with a mixture of admiration and concern. Diana's growing independence and her willingness to challenge royal protocol made her powerful enemies within the establishment, enemies who would not hesitate to destroy her if they discovered she was still thinking about her lost son. James had been promoted twice since Elizabeth's death, and his new position as a senior guard gave him greater access to palace communications and visitor logs. He used this access carefully, looking for any signs that Diana might be secretly investigating Alexander's whereabouts. He monitored her correspondence, watched her private meetings, and paid attention to any unexplained absences from her official schedule. What he found worried him deeply. Diana was indeed searching for her second son, but she was being extraordinarily careful about it. She had begun making charitable visits to small towns throughout England, always with official justifications. But James noticed that many of these visits took her to areas within driving distance of Birmingham and the surrounding countryside. She was looking for Alexander, trying to find him without arousing suspicion. The breakthrough came in March of 1986. James was reviewing security reports from Diana's recent trips when he noticed something unusual. During a visit to a children's hospital in Coventry, just 20 miles from Millbrook, Diana had requested an unscheduled stop at a local school. The official reason given was that she wanted to meet with teachers about a new literacy program, but James knew Diana well enough to recognize the signs of a carefully planned deviation from her itinerary. That night, James made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He drove to Millbrook. The town was exactly what he had expected from Diana's letter, a quiet rural community where everyone knew everyone else's business. James parked his car near the town center and walked through the streets, looking for any sign of the Henderson family or a boy who might be Alexander. He felt like a spy in his own country, searching for a child who had been hidden in plain sight. It didn't take long to find them. The Henderson family lived in a modest two-story house on Maple Street, with a small garden and a red front door that needed painting. James positioned himself across the street, hidden behind a row of shops, and waited. Just after 4 o'clock, the local school let out, and children began walking home through the quiet streets. James's heart nearly stopped when he saw the boy walking toward the Henderson house. Alexander was dressed in simple, well-worn clothes rather than the expensive outfits that William wore. His hair was slightly longer and less carefully styled. And, most importantly, there was a freedom in his movements, a lack of self-consciousness that William would never be allowed to develop. Alexander Henderson was just a normal little boy, walking home from school without bodyguards or photographers or the weight of a crown waiting for him in the future. James watched as Alexander ran up to the red door and disappeared inside the house. A few minutes later, a woman appeared at one of the upstairs windows, her face kind and maternal as she watched the street. This had to be Margaret Henderson, the teacher who had been chosen to raise a prince without knowing it. For nearly an hour, James remained hidden across the street, watching the ordinary domestic scene unfold in the Henderson household. He saw Alexander playing in the back garden, saw Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry on a line, saw Mr. Henderson arrive home from work and swing his adopted son up into the air with obvious affection and joy. This was what Diana had been forced to give up. This was the childhood that had been stolen from one son and kept secret from the other. James felt tears stinging his eyes as he realized the full scope of the tragedy that had been set in motion on that night in 1982. But James also realized something else as he watched the Henderson family. Alexander was happy. He was loved. He was living the normal life that Diana had been told he would have, free from the pressures and dangers that came with royal birth. The people who had orchestrated his adoption had kept their promise, at least in this regard. Alexander Henderson was safe and secure and completely unaware of the storm that would engulf his life if the truth ever came out. James drove back to London that night, with his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. He had found Alexander, confirmed his identity, and seen that he was well cared for. But he had also seen how devastating it would be for everyone involved if the secret was revealed prematurely. Alexander had a family who loved him. William had his own life and responsibilities. And Diana was playing an increasingly dangerous game by continuing to search for her lost son. 2 weeks later, James's worst fears were confirmed. He was monitoring palace communications when he intercepted a message from Sir Edmund Hartwell to the head of palace security. Diana had been observed making inquiries about adoption agencies in the Birmingham area. Her activities were being investigated, and there were concerns about her emotional stability and her fitness to continue her royal duties. James realized that Diana was in serious danger. The people who had arranged Alexander's adoption would not hesitate to destroy her if they thought she was going to expose their secret. He had to warn her, but he also had to make her understand that her search for Alexander was putting everyone at risk. The opportunity came during a state dinner at the palace. James was assigned to security duty in the corridor outside the dining room, and he knew that Diana would have to pass his position when she retired for the evening. When she appeared, walking alone as she often did after public events, James stepped forward. "Your Royal Highness," he said quietly, "I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Diana looked surprised, but she nodded and followed him to a small alcove where they could talk privately. "I found him," James said without preamble. "I found Alexander." Diana's face went white. "Where? How is he? Is he? He's safe," James said quickly. "He's happy. The Henderson family loves him very much, and he's living exactly the kind of life you were promised he would have." Tears filled Diana's eyes. "I knew you would find him eventually. I've been looking too, but I haven't been able to get close enough to—" "Your Royal Highness," James interrupted, "you have to stop looking for him. They know what you're doing. Sir Edmund and the others, they're watching you, investigating your activities. If they realize how close you've come to finding Alexander, they'll do whatever it takes to stop you." Diana stared at him in shock. "Are you saying they would hurt him?" "I'm saying they would hurt anyone they had to in order to protect this secret," James replied. "Including you." The color drained from Diana's face. "But he's my son. I have a right to see him, to know that he's okay." "And someday you will," James said. "But not now. Not while the people who arranged his adoption are still alive and still in positions of power. Your Royal Highness, I need you to promise me that you'll stop looking for him. Let me be the one who watches over him. Let me be the one who makes sure he's safe and happy. And when the time is right, when it's safe for everyone involved, I'll help you bring the truth to light." Diana was quiet for a long time, tears streaming down her face. Finally, she nodded. "Promise me you'll check on him regularly. Promise me you'll let me know if anything changes, if he's ever in danger, or if he needs anything." "I promise," James said. "I'll watch over him like he was my own son." From that night forward, James became Alexander Henderson's secret guardian. Once every few months, he would make the drive to Millbrook, always with a cover story about visiting relatives in the area. He would park in different locations around the town, watching from a distance as Alexander grew from a young boy into a teenager. The years passed, and James watched both princes develop in their separate worlds. Prince William grew up in the spotlight, attending the best schools, traveling the world, learning the responsibilities that would someday make him king. Alexander Henderson grew up in Millbrook, attending the local comprehensive school, playing football with his friends, completely unaware that his life should have been entirely different. The differences between the twins became more pronounced as they aged, shaped by their vastly different environments. William developed the formal manners and careful speech patterns of royalty. Alexander kept the broad accent and casual mannerisms of rural England. William learned to live with constant public scrutiny. Alexander experienced the freedom of anonymity, but the physical resemblance remained unmistakable. By the time they were both 16, James could see that anyone who looked closely would immediately recognize the similarity between Prince William and Alexander Henderson. The same bone structure, the same eye color, the same distinctive way of smiling that was pure Diana. It was during this period that James began to worry about discovery. Alexander was becoming more visible as he grew older, participating in local sports teams, appearing in school photographs that were sometimes published in regional newspapers. If anyone with knowledge of the royal family happened to see those photographs, the resemblance would be obvious. James's fears were realized in 1998, when Alexander Henderson was 16 years old. A freelance photographer who had been hired to cover a local football match in Millbrook took a photograph of the winning team. Alexander was in the center of the group photo, grinning broadly with a trophy in his hands. The photograph was picked up by a regional newspaper, then by a national sports magazine, and finally by a gossip website that specialized in royal news. The headline that appeared on the website made James's blood run cold. "Royal Lookalike. Local football star bears striking resemblance to Prince William." Within hours, the photograph was circulating on social media and royal fan sites. People began speculating about the identity of the mysterious boy who looked so much like the future king. Some suggested he might be an illegitimate son of Prince Charles. Others wondered if he could be a distant cousin whose resemblance was purely coincidental. James knew it was only a matter of time before someone with real knowledge and resources began investigating Alexander's background. When that happened, the carefully constructed fiction of his adoption would unravel, and the truth about his royal birth would come to light. But then, something unexpected happened that would change everything. On August 31st, 1997, Princess Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris. James learned about Diana's death from a frantic phone call at 3 in the morning. He sat in his small apartment, staring at the television as news anchors struggled to find words for the tragedy that had shocked the world. The people's princess was dead, and with her died any hope that she would someday be reunited with her lost son. In the days that followed Diana's funeral, James realized that he was now the only person in the world who knew the complete truth about Alexander Henderson's identity. Sir Edmund Hartwell had died of a stroke 2 years earlier. The doctors who had been present at the twins' birth had either died or disappeared into retirement. The adoption records had undoubtedly been destroyed or hidden so deeply that they would never be found. James Crawford, a coal miner's son from Manchester, had become the sole guardian of one of the most explosive secrets in British history. And now he faced a terrible choice. Should he reveal the truth about Alexander's identity while the boy was still young enough to adjust to the revelation? Or should he continue to protect the secret, knowing that every passing day made it more difficult for Alexander to reclaim his rightful place in the world? As James watched Prince William's grief-stricken face during his mother's funeral, he made a decision that would define the next 25 years of his life. He would wait. He would continue to watch over Alexander Henderson from a distance, protecting him from discovery until William was mature enough and strong enough to handle the truth about his twin brother. James didn't know it would take another 25 years for that moment to arrive. He didn't know that Alexander Henderson would grow up, get married, have children, and build an entire life based on a lie. He didn't know that his own health would begin to fail, making it increasingly urgent to find the right time and the right way to reveal the secret he had carried for so long. All James knew was that someday, somehow, the two princes would need to learn the truth about each other. And when that day came, he would be ready to tell them the story of the night when one brother was chosen to be king, and the other was condemned to live in the shadows. The new millennium brought changes that James Crawford never could have anticipated when he first accepted guardianship of the royal secret. Technology was transforming the world in ways that made secrets increasingly difficult to keep. The internet had created a global network where information could spread instantly, where photographs could be analyzed and compared with sophisticated software, where amateur investigators could piece together mysteries that had been buried for decades. James was now 46 years old, a senior member of the palace security staff with an impeccable reputation and the complete trust of the royal family. His hair had begun to gray at the temples, and the long years of carrying such a heavy secret had left lines around his eyes that made him look older than his age. But his commitment to protecting Alexander Henderson's identity had never wavered, even as the task became increasingly complex. Prince William was now 18, attending Eton College and preparing for university. He had grown into a young man who bore a striking resemblance to his mother, with Diana's compassionate nature and her ability to connect with people from all walks of life. James often watched William during official functions and saw flashes of the woman who had trusted him with the most important secret of her life. Alexander Henderson, meanwhile, had just finished his A-levels and was working in a garage in Millbrook while deciding whether to pursue further education. James had continued his secret surveillance over the years, watching from a distance as Diana's second son grew into a fine young man. Alexander had inherited his mother's warmth and his unknown father's sense of duty, though these qualities were expressed through small-town kindness rather than royal obligation. The physical resemblance between the twins had remained remarkable as they entered adulthood. James estimated that anyone who saw them together would immediately recognize them as brothers, if not twins. This similarity had become both a blessing and a curse, making Alexander increasingly visible while simultaneously making it more dangerous for the truth to be revealed. The crisis that James had been dreading for years finally arrived in the spring of 2001. Alexander Henderson had been selected to represent his region in a national apprenticeship program for young mechanics. The program included a ceremony at Westminster, just a few miles from Buckingham Palace, where the apprentices would meet with government officials and receive their certificates. James learned about Alexander's trip to London through his regular monitoring of local newspapers in the Millbrook area. The moment he read the announcement, he knew that disaster was imminent. Alexander would be in London for 3 days, attending events and ceremonies where he might encounter anyone from journalists to government officials to members of the royal household. The risk of recognition was enormous. James requested emergency leave and spent the next week developing a plan to monitor Alexander's visit without interfering with his activities. He studied the apprenticeship program schedule, identified potential danger points, and prepared contingency plans for different scenarios. But he also knew that his ability to control the situation was limited. If Alexander encountered the wrong person at the wrong moment, 40 years of secrecy could unravel in an instant. The first day of Alexander's visit passed without incident. James followed him at a distance as he toured government buildings and attended meetings with other apprentices. Alexander seemed excited to be in London, taking photographs of famous landmarks and clearly enjoying his first visit to the capital. He looked every inch the country boy discovering the big city, completely unaware of the royal blood flowing through his veins. But on the second day, James's worst fears nearly came to pass. Alexander's group was touring the Houses of Parliament when their guide, a young woman named Sarah Phillips who worked in the public relations department, stopped mid-sentence and stared at Alexander with obvious shock. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaky with surprise. "Has anyone ever told you that you look exactly like Prince William?" The other apprentices laughed and began examining Alexander more closely. Several of them pulled out their mobile phones to take photographs, comparing Alexander's face to images of the prince that they found online. The resemblance was so obvious that even the other teenagers could see it immediately. "It's incredible," one of the other apprentices said. "You could be his twin brother." James, watching from the public gallery above the tour group, felt his heart racing as he realized how close the secret was to being exposed. If Sarah Phillips had any connections to the royal household or to journalists who covered the royal family, Alexander's identity could be discovered within hours. Alexander himself seemed embarrassed by the attention. "People have mentioned it before," he said with a slight blush. "But I don't see it myself. Prince William's much more handsome than I am." The group laughed, and the tour continued, but James noticed that Sarah Phillips kept glancing at Alexander throughout the rest of the visit. When the tour ended, she approached Alexander privately. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you earlier," she said, "but the resemblance really is remarkable. Have you ever thought about entering any of those royal look-alike competitions? You could probably win quite a bit of money." Alexander smiled politely, but shook his head. "I'm not really interested in that sort of thing. I just want to finish my apprenticeship and get back to work." James breathed a sigh of relief as Alexander rejoined his group and left the Parliament building. The immediate crisis had passed, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone with more resources and connections made the same observation that Sarah Phillips had made. That evening, James made a decision that would define the next phase of his guardianship. He drove to Millbrook and, for the first time in 19 years, approached Alexander Henderson directly. James had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, but he still felt nervous as he knocked on the door of the Red House on Maple Street. Mrs. Henderson answered, looking older but still kind and maternal. She invited James in for tea when he explained that he was a government worker conducting follow-up interviews with apprenticeship program participants. Alexander appeared a few minutes later, and James was struck by how much he resembled Prince William in person. The photographs and distant observations had not prepared him for the full impact of seeing Diana's second son face to face. It was like looking at William in a funhouse mirror, the same features arranged in slightly different proportions, shaped by a completely different life. "Mr. Henderson," James said, extending his hand. "I'm James Crawford from the Department of Education." I'd like to ask you a few questions about your experience in London this week. Alexander shook his hand with a firm grip and a confident smile. Of course, sir. Though I have to say, it was brilliant. I never imagined London was so big and busy. They talked for nearly an hour, with James asking carefully crafted questions designed to assess Alexander's knowledge of his own background and his level of curiosity about his origins. What he discovered both relieved and worried him. Alexander knew he was adopted, but he had never shown much interest in learning about his birth parents. The Hendersons had told him that his mother had died in childbirth, and that his father was unknown. Alexander had accepted this explanation without question, focusing instead on the family that had raised him with such obvious love and dedication. I've had a good life here in Millbrook, Alexander told James. Mom and Dad Henderson are the only parents I've ever known, and I couldn't ask for better ones. I suppose I'm curious about where I came from originally, but not curious enough to go looking for answers that might hurt the people who've given me everything. James felt a mixture of admiration and sadness as he listened to Alexander speak. Diana's second son had grown into exactly the kind of man she would have been proud of, thoughtful and loyal and completely unselfish. But he was also living a life built on lies, unaware of his true heritage and his rightful place in the world. As James prepared to leave, Alexander walked him to the door. "Mr. Crawford," he said, "can I ask you something? That girl in London, the one giving the tour, she said I looked like Prince William. Other people have said the same thing over the years. Do you think there could be any connection? I mean, could I be related to the royal family somehow?" James felt his heart skip a beat. "What makes you ask that?" Alexander shrugged. "I don't know. It just seems odd that the resemblance is so strong. And sometimes I feel like there's something about my background that doesn't quite add up. Little things, you know? Documents that seem newer than they should be, stories that don't quite match up." James chose his words very carefully. "Alexander, sometimes resemblances are just coincidences. The world is full of people who look like other people without being related to them. As for your background, adoption records from that period were often incomplete or poorly maintained. I wouldn't read too much into inconsistencies." Alexander nodded, but James could see that he wasn't entirely convinced. Diana's son had inherited his mother's intelligence, and he was beginning to ask the right questions. That night, James drove back to London knowing that time was running out. Alexander was becoming suspicious about his own origins. Technology was making it easier for amateur investigators to dig into official records. And most importantly, Prince William was about to enter a phase of his life where the revelation of a twin brother could have enormous political and personal consequences. William was preparing to attend the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he would study art history and geography. The decision to allow the future king to attend university like any other young person was being hailed as a modernization of the monarchy, but James knew it also created new risks. University life would expose William to ideas and people that might make him more receptive to learning about his lost brother. But it would also place him in an environment where secrets were harder to control. James spent the next several months developing a new strategy for protecting Alexander's identity while preparing for the eventual revelation of the truth. He began keeping detailed records of his observations, documenting Alexander's development and his growing resemblance to Prince William. He also started researching the legal and constitutional implications of revealing the existence of a second heir to the throne. What he discovered was troubling. If Alexander's royal parentage was proven, it would raise serious questions about the legitimacy of the entire succession. As an identical twin born within minutes of Prince William, Alexander would have an equal claim to the throne. The revelation could potentially trigger a constitutional crisis that would threaten the stability of the monarchy itself. But James also knew that the secret could not be kept forever. Alexander was asking questions about his background. Technology was making it easier to uncover buried information. And most importantly, James himself was getting older, and his health was beginning to decline. The chest pains that had started as occasional discomfort were becoming more frequent and more severe. His doctor had warned him about stress and the importance of addressing unresolved issues in his life. James realized that he was facing a race against time. He needed to find the right moment to reveal the truth about Alexander's identity, but he also needed to do it in a way that protected both brothers from the chaos that would inevitably follow. The secret that had begun with a dying woman's confession was now approaching its final act, and James Crawford was the only person who could determine how the story would end. As 2002 approached, James made a fateful decision. He would begin preparing both princes for the revelation of their brotherhood, starting with subtle hints and gradually building toward a full disclosure of the truth. He didn't know exactly how he would accomplish this, but he knew he was running out of time to figure it out. The 40-year secret was about to begin its final chapter, and James Crawford was determined to see it through to the end, no matter what the cost to himself or to the monarchy he had served faithfully for so many years. The year 2022 marked 4 decades since James Crawford first learned the secret that had defined his life. Now 68 years old and suffering from a weak heart that his doctors warned could give out at any moment, James knew his time was running out. The secret of Prince William's twin brother had become a burden too heavy for one man to carry alone, especially when that man was facing his own mortality. Prince William was now 40 years old, the Duke of Cambridge, married to Catherine Middleton with 3 children of his own. He had grown into a thoughtful, responsible man who carried the weight of his future kingship with dignity and grace. James often watched William during official functions and saw flashes of the compassionate young woman who had first trusted him with this impossible secret. Alexander Henderson, meanwhile, had built a quiet life in Millbrook that was everything Princess Diana had hoped for when she was forced to give him up. He had married Emma Cartwright, a local teacher, in a small ceremony at the village church. They had 2 children, Sarah and Michael, who were now 15 and 13 years old respectively. Alexander worked as the manager of the garage where he had started as an apprentice, and he was known throughout the community as a kind, reliable man who helped his neighbors and coached the local youth football team. But the physical resemblance between the royal brothers remained unmistakable. James had watched in growing anxiety as social media and advanced facial recognition software made it increasingly likely that someone would notice the similarity between Prince William and the mechanic from Millbrook. Several times over the years, photographs of Alexander at local events had been shared online by people who remarked on his striking resemblance to the future king. So far, these observations have been dismissed as mere coincidence, but James knew it was only a matter of time before someone with real resources began investigating. The crisis that James had been dreading for 20 years finally arrived in March of 2022 when Alexander's daughter Sarah was selected to represent her school at a national science competition in London. The competition was being held at Imperial College, and among the judges was Professor David Ainsworth, a geneticist who had done consulting work for several royal biographers. James learned about Sarah Henderson's trip to London through his continued monitoring of local newspapers in the Millbrook area. The moment he saw her photograph in the paper, announcing her selection for the science competition, he knew that time had run out. Sarah Henderson was 15 years old and bore an unmistakable resemblance to both her father and Prince William. If Professor Ainsworth saw her, the connection would be obvious to anyone with knowledge of royal genetics and family resemblances. James spent 3 sleepless nights trying to decide what to do. His first instinct was to find a way to prevent Sarah from attending the competition, but he realized that such interference would only raise suspicions and potentially put Alexander's family in danger. His second thought was to warn Alexander about the risks, but that would require revealing his own knowledge of the family's true background, which could trigger exactly the kind of investigation that he had been trying to prevent for 4 decades. In the end, James made the decision that would define the final chapter of his guardianship. He would reveal the truth, but he would do it on his own terms, in a way that protected both princes and their families while ensuring that the secret finally came to light. On March 15th, 2022, James drafted 2 letters. The first was addressed to Prince William, care of Kensington Palace. The second was addressed to Alexander Henderson in Millbrook. Both letters contained the same explosive information, told from slightly different perspectives, but with the same devastating conclusion. They were identical twin brothers who had been separated at birth for political reasons that had never been justified by the love and loyalty that both men had shown to their families and their country. James included copies of Princess Diana's original letter in both envelopes, along with detailed accounts of his 40 years of surveillance and protection. He also included photographs that he had taken over the years, showing both men at similar ages and in similar poses, making their brotherhood undeniable to anyone who looked at the evidence with an open mind. But James also knew that simply sending the letters would create chaos without providing any framework for how the brothers might handle the revelation. So he included a third element in each envelope, a proposal for how the truth could be revealed publicly in a way that protected the monarchy while honoring the bond that should have existed between the brothers all along. James's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He proposed that Prince William and Alexander Henderson meet privately, away from the press and the palace officials who would want to control the narrative. He suggested that they spend time getting to know each other as individuals before deciding how to handle the public revelation of their relationship. And he recommended that any public announcement be framed not as a threat to the monarchy, but as a testament to the strength of family bonds and the importance of truth over political convenience. The letters were sent on March 20th, 2022, by special courier to ensure they would be delivered directly to their intended recipients without being intercepted by palace staff or other intermediaries. James spent the next week in a state of nervous anticipation, wondering how both men would react to learning the truth about their origins. He had prepared for various scenarios, from complete disbelief to immediate demands for DNA testing to angry accusations about the decades of deception that had kept them apart. What he didn't expect was silence. Days passed without any response from either Prince William or Alexander Henderson. James began to worry that the letters had been intercepted or dismissed as the work of a crank or conspiracy theorist. He had spent 40 years protecting this secret, and the possibility that it might be ignored or suppressed at the final moment was almost unbearable. The breakthrough came on March 28th, when James received a phone call at his modest London apartment. The voice on the other end was unmistakably royal, educated, and careful, but also strained with emotion. "Mr. Crawford, this is William. I received your letter." James felt his heart skip a beat. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for calling." "Is it true?" William asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do I really have a twin brother?" "Yes, sir," James replied. "Everything in that letter is true. I've been watching over your brother for 40 years, waiting for the right time to bring you together." There was a long silence on the phone. When William spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I've always felt like something was missing. Even as a child, I sometimes felt like I was looking for someone who should have been there. My mother, did she know? Did she plan for this day? She wrote that letter hoping that someday you would learn the truth," James said. "She loved both of you equally, and she never stopped hoping that you would know each other." "I want to meet him," William said immediately. "Can you arrange it? Privately, away from everyone who will want to turn this into a political crisis." James smiled for the first time in weeks. "I think that could be arranged, sir. Your brother feels the same way." The meeting between Prince William and Alexander Henderson took place on April 10th, 2022, in a small cottage in the Cotswolds that James had arranged to borrow from a friend. Both men arrived separately, both nervous about what they would find when they came face to face with a brother they had never known existed. James had worried about how the two men would react to each other, given their vastly different backgrounds and life experiences. Prince William arrived in a simple car with just one bodyguard, dressed casually, but still carrying himself with the dignity that came from a lifetime of royal training. Alexander Henderson arrived in his own car, alone, wearing his best clothes, but clearly uncomfortable with the formality of the situation. But the moment they saw each other, all the awkwardness and uncertainty disappeared. The physical resemblance was so striking that both men stopped short, staring at each other with expressions of wonder and recognition. "My God," William whispered. "It's like looking in a mirror." Alexander nodded, tears in his eyes. "I've been seeing your face in photographs my whole life, wondering why everyone said we looked alike. Now I know." They talked for hours that day, sharing stories about their childhoods, their families, their hopes, and fears. James watched from a distance, marveling at how quickly they connected despite the vastly different worlds they had inhabited. They laughed at the same jokes, shared the same mannerisms, and displayed the same combination of intelligence and compassion that they had inherited from their mother. Most importantly, they both understood the delicate situation they were facing. Both men had families to protect, responsibilities to fulfill, and public roles that could be disrupted by the revelation of their relationship. They agreed that any public announcement would need to be carefully planned and executed in a way that minimized harm to everyone involved. Over the following months, William and Alexander met regularly, always in secret, always with James serving as their intermediary and protector. They developed the kind of relationship that should have been theirs from birth, supporting each other through the challenges of their very different lives, while learning to navigate the complex emotions that came with discovering a missing part of themselves. The public revelation came on June 21st, 2022, exactly 40 years after their birth. In a carefully crafted joint statement, Prince William and Alexander Henderson announced their brotherhood to the world, explaining the circumstances of their separation and their decision to build a relationship based on family love rather than political calculation. The statement was released simultaneously with a longer document that James had prepared, detailing his 40 years of guardianship and the steps that had been taken to protect both men throughout their lives. The document included copies of Princess Diana's original letter, photographs documenting the brothers' parallel development, and a comprehensive explanation of why the secret had been kept for so long. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The story dominated headlines around the world, with commentators debating everything from the constitutional implications of Alexander's royal parentage to the emotional impact of the brothers' reunion. But the overwhelming response was positive, with people expressing admiration for both men's dignity in handling such an extraordinary situation. Alexander Henderson made the decision that surprised many observers but proved his character to those who knew him best. He announced that he had no desire to claim any royal titles or privileges, that he was content with the life he had built in Millbrook, and that he wanted to support his brother William in whatever way he could without disrupting the established order of succession. "I've had a wonderful life with the Henderson family," Alexander said in his first public interview. "I don't need crowns or titles to know who I am or where I belong. What I needed was to know my brother, and now I do. That's enough for me." Prince William, meanwhile, used the revelation as an opportunity to speak about the importance of family bonds and the strength that comes from truth over secrecy. He announced the establishment of the Alexander Henderson Foundation, dedicated to supporting adoption services and helping separated families reconnect. James Crawford watched these developments with a mixture of pride and relief. The secret that had consumed 40 years of his life was finally, in the open, handled with the dignity and wisdom that both princes had inherited from their mother. He had kept faith with Elizabeth Morrison's dying wish and Princess Diana's desperate hope that her sons would someday know each other. On December 15th, 2022, James Crawford died peacefully in his sleep, his heart finally giving out after decades of carrying the weight of the royal secret. His funeral was attended by both Prince William and Alexander Henderson, two brothers who had been brought together by the dedication and sacrifice of a humble palace guard who had understood the true meaning of loyalty. In the months that followed, the story of James Crawford's 40-year mission became a testament to the power of individual conscience and the importance of protecting truth even when it challenges established power. Books were written, documentaries were made, and historians debated the implications of the secret that had been hidden in plain sight for 4 decades. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to James Crawford's legacy was the relationship between Prince William and Alexander Henderson, two brothers who had been given the gift of knowing each other thanks to the courage and dedication of a man who had promised a dying woman that he would watch over her sons until they could be reunited. The secret was finally revealed, the brothers were finally together, and the truth that had been buried for 40 years was finally free to heal the wounds that had been inflicted by decades of separation and deception. James Crawford had kept his promise, and in doing so, he had changed the course of history in ways that would echo through generations of the royal family and the country they served.